This is Radio TV Phono Nut, and here we have an Imperial 4-speed kitty record player. No, I'm kind of getting I'm kind of losing interest in these cheaper 60s and newer kitty phonographs with the plastic tone arm on them. I like the older ones with the metal arm, particularly the ones with the standard half-inch cartridge mounting, but I picked this one up because it's in nice shape. It's got some imperfections, but out of all these I've had over the years, this one's in by far the nicest shape, and it still has the instruction card on the turntable platter. And you can see what all it says there, just the warning that when the set's not in use, to turn it off, and the needle instructions. And here they give the needle options for two different tone arm styles. Tone arm number 1 that has the turnover cartridge has a 0.7 mil on the LP side and a 2.8 mil needle on the other side for 78s. And then tone arm option number 2 just has a single 0.7 mil stylus for LP. Well, unfortunately, this one uses tone arm option number 2. And me personally, I think if a record player is going to have multiple speeds that include 78, it should have the proper flip needle or flip cartridge to give you the right needle for playing 78s. But on that note, it's not like I don't have other players that will play 78s. And they probably figured by the time this one was made that the only 78s that would be played would be the newer micro groove kitty records, so no need to put a flip cartridge. Now, one thing that makes this special is the year it was made. I've already peeked inside and I looked around for date codes, and by using my magnifier I was able to see a 1970 date code on the volume control. So that would put this about the end of the line as far as a vacuum tube amplified kitty phonograph. In fact, most companies had gone solid state by about 66, 67, but there were still a few stragglers there for the last few years of the 60s and into the very early 70s that still cranked out some tube models, and this is one of the stragglers. I think they still made the tube one in 70 and maybe into 71. By 72, Imperial had switched over to using a solid state amplifier, and I can tell you the tube amplified model sounds better. Now, I've already plugged this in and it has the usual problems: frozen up motor and bad filter capacitor. I did rake my finger across the needle and got static in the speakers, so we know the cartridge at least has some output. But looking at the cabinet, it's in very good cosmetic shape. The latch is not rusty on it. The cabinet's not all torn and discolored. We've got a little bit of lifting right here on this corner. A little dab of glue will fix that. And on the bottom, we've got a little discoloration where maybe the record player was slid on something. We've got a little lifting back here, but once again, a little bit of glue will fix that. But this record player either wasn't used much and just shoved into a closet where it sat for the next 40-something years, or whoever used it was a rare exception to the rule as far as kids who take care of their stuff. Maybe they actually had parents who taught them to take care of what you have, and if you mess it up, then you're going to get it taken away from you, and you're not going to get another one. I can tell you that these Imperial branded record players were made throughout the 70s and maybe into the early 80s. They just underwent some design changes over the years. In other words, they cheapened them out over the years. I know they used Alliance and General Industries drive mechanisms up through the early 70s, and then they switched to using BSR and Matsushita mechanisms in later years, and of course used tinier speakers and cheaper amplifiers in the later ones, but the tube-type models from the late 60s and early 70s are by far the best ones. Underside of the chassis here, we've got a typical Alliance drive mechanism. The filter capacitor is branded Temple and was made in Mexico. The speaker in the 25EH5 tube were made in Japan, and I'm sure this blue film cap was made in Japan too. Not sure about the volume control or the Selenium Rectifier. They look to be possibly American made, but it's kind of odd that something made in 1970 would still have a Selenium Rectifier in it. I used to have the version of this from 1968, and it actually had a silicon rectifier, but probably what happened, they got a good deal on a boatload of old Selenium rectifiers, so they bought them up and used them. And this tube is not branded. All it says is 25EH5 and Japan on it. I don't know how well that's showing up on the camera. Probably not worth a darn. But when I did look at this under my closed circuit magnifier, that control is dated 1970, I think the 28th week of 70. Alright, we'll get it down to my bench now and do the usual overhaul on it. Okay, electrically we have the filter capacitors in place. I have not mechanically attached them anywhere yet. Now right now we want to replace this Selenium Rectifier with a more modern silicon diode, but before we do that we need to see what the voltage is at the cathode of this Selenium Rectifier, so we'll know what to aim for with our silicon diode. So let's turn it on and see what we got. Start out at 165 unloaded, so we'll let the tubes warm up, or the tube warm up. There's only one. Yeah, this motor is froze up. It's not even turning, as you can see. Alright, we've got 153 volts with a warmed up amplifier. So we'll just round it up to 155 is what we'll look for with the silicon diode. Okay, there's only two resistors in here. The 120 ohm cathode resistor, it's good. However, the 10,000 ohm screen grid dropping resistor is up to 15K, so we'll go ahead and get rid of that. Alright, well, that's good. Just fall down and break, why don't you? It's not going to remain in nice cosmetic shape with that going on. Alright, anyway, this looks like a General Industries Selenium Rectifier, and I've removed it from the chassis, and we'll just throw it in our box of stuff to use for resurrections. And we'll put a terminal strip here for our silicon diode, and then with the big rectifier gone, we can mount our filter capacitor terminal strip up here too and have plenty of room. Okay, for the possible exception of adding a cathode bypass cap to give the amplifier a little more kick and bass, we're done with the amp. We have the filter capacitors mounted on a terminal strip here, and the diode and a 56 ohm series resistor ahead of the diode that gets our B+ voltage close to what it was. And I committed repairman's sin by J-hooking this resistor onto this tube socket terminal, because I did not want to break the tube socket pin off. I've already got a record player here already with a broken tube socket from me trying to be ultra neat. 154 volts and the amp is working. Okay, now let's get this motor freed up, and I'll give you a little word of warning about these Alliance motors. And the way you know it's an Alliance motor is if you have a bottom bushing assembly that's smooth here and looks like this, some are gold, some are silver, it's an Alliance. Also, most Alliance motors, the speed orientation is 16, 33, 45, 78 in neutral, whereas the General Industries motors usually have the neutral position between 33 and 45, and they have a little GI logo on the bottom bushing assembly. If you ever run into these, it's a stuck motor like this one is, and if this bottom bushing assembly, after removing the bolts, does not easily slide off, do not force it, because you can pull the bushing out of this little assembly here, and once you pull it out, there's no getting it back in here. Don't ask how I know. You'll need to use heat applied to usually a soldering iron will do, and get this hot enough to get the old gunky grease to loosen up, and then you can pull it off and then clean it all out, lubricate it, and put it back together. Now we have 3 nuts that must be removed to get the motor out, but in order to get to the nuts we have to remove the idler wheel, and it's held in place by this tiny E-clip that you'll want to carefully remove with a small flat blade screwdriver, and take care not to lose it. And then there'll be some washers above the wheel and under it. You want to keep up with those and not lose them either. Now we have exposure to the bolts here, the nuts. You'll need a 1/4-inch nut driver and a flat blade screwdriver to get these out. And whenever you get them out, keep in mind that this silver colored bolt is used to hold the, well, we'll show you where it's located. It's back here beside the motor coil. The 2 darker colored bolts hold the bushing assemblies in place. And I believe the spacers are different lengths, so you want to, probably the best thing to do is once you get everything off, just put the washer and the nut back on this rear bolt that's by the motor coil, and then that way you can keep that spacer where it's supposed to be. And then you, of course, will have to take these spacers and nuts and bolts off to get the motor apart, to clean it and lubricate it. Alright, I have all the nuts and the top washers removed, and this is where it gets a little tricky. The way I like to do it is hold my fingers over each one of the screw heads, bolt heads, and then gently drop the motor, making sure not to lose any of the spacers or the other washers underneath here in the process. Alright, here we are, and this is what you should see. Now I'm going to put the washer and the nut back onto this bolt that's over by the motor coil, the field coil, and that will get that out of my way because we don't have to remove that. Okay, there's that nut and washer, so we no longer have to pay any attention to this bolt here because the nut and washer is holding on. I'm still holding my fingers on the bolt heads on these bushing assemblies to keep them from falling out. And you see how we're oriented. We have a smaller spacer, the washer, and then a bigger spacer. Now I'm going to just lift all that off and put it in my tray over here. And in this case, my tray is the record player case. Now keep in mind these bolts will have some little lock washers on. As you can see, some little lock washers at the head end of the bolt. You want to make sure not to lose them. Okay, this bottom bushing assembly is not coming off with ultimate ease, and I'm not going to force it, so we're just going to take my soldering iron tip, stick it down in here. You may have to hold it for several minutes and get this hot enough to where the grease will soften up, and you can just pull this off without possibly pulling the actual bushing out. Alright, that came off pretty easy, just maybe 30 seconds of heat from the soldering iron. That wasn't nearly as stuck as I've seen them some stuck in the past. And another reason for leaving this bolt in place is it'll help you keep track of the top of your motor here, because if you were to accidentally flip this around and put it all back together, your motor would run backwards. Now that might be a good way of listening for hidden messages in Yoko Ono albums, but really wouldn't be too good for listening to your records in a normal fashion. And while we've got the motor out, it's a good time to check the motor mounting grommets. They're still nice and spongy, which is what we want. If they're hard or crackling or crumbling apart, then you'll want to replace them. But these are still okay, and that's good because I'm running low on these. I need to order some. Now we need to take our paper towel damped in alcohol and clean this motor shaft off, get all the gunk off of it. Now the only way you can get this top bushing assembly off of the shaft is to remove this spring here. That increases the diameter of the shaft for the proper speed at 78 RPM. But that spring can be a real pain in the butt to get back on there, and it's easy to lose, so I usually don't remove it unless I just have to. I just clean all this top part off the best I can with alcohol and Q-tips and a paper towel, and then re-oil it. And once we get the shaft clean, we will take a Q-tip dipped in alcohol and dip it down in here and clean out this bushing. Now if this was really, really gunked up, I would suggest soaking this bottom bushing assembly and this whole assembly here in acetone overnight to get all the gunk out of it. Actually, in this case, you probably would be better carefully removing the spring and just soaking the top and bottom bushing assemblies in acetone and to make sure you get them cleaned out good. But normally I can get away with just cleaning them with Q-tips and paper towels and alcohol and getting them ungunked. And that's what came off of the bottom of the motor shaft, and that's just a combination of old oil and dirt and gunk that's mixed together to form paste, and that's what causes your motor to stick up. So on that note, when you got a stuck motor, just putting a few drops of oil on it is not going to free it up. You've got to take it apart and actually clean it. Alright, we're all cleaned up. Now we want to saturate the wicking on both ends and put a few drops down into the bushing itself of Zoom Spout or the blue 3-in-1 electric motor oil. Any lightweight non-detergent oil should work. Never use the red 3-in-1 oil because it has detergent and it will gunk up your motor. Alright, the motor's in with the bolts hand tightened, and as you're tightening, wrap on the motor like this with the butt end of a screwdriver or wrench or whatever, and then constantly check and make sure your rotor is turning freely. It must turn free. It cannot bind, because if it does, then obviously you're going to have problems. Okay, it's thoroughly tightened and freed up, and it's running like a top. Now the next thing we need to do is remove this spindle, which is held in place by a clip from underneath. Clean the spindle and the bushing with alcohol, and then re-lubricate it with Phono-Lube or white lithium grease or whatever you have handy, and put a couple of drops of Zoom Spout mixed in with that to make it turn a little freer whenever you put it all back together. Alright, platter bearing lubricated, and it runs smooth now. No jerky rattling sounds. Alright, next we need to clean all this top side stuff up and lubricate it. Alright, I'll remove this entire idler wheel assembly from this post here, which is held in place by that spring and that E-clip, so be careful. You don't want any of those parts to fly. Makes it easier for me to get in here and clean all this gunk out. And then I'm going to separate these two pieces, which are held in place by this little E-clip, and be careful not to lose that either. And we'll clean all this up, put a drop of oil on this shaft and put it back together, and then we'll clean this shaft up and put a drop of oil on it. Clean this hole out here with a Q-tip dipped in alcohol. Okay, I put some oil on this shaft that the idler arm assembly rides on, as well as put a coating of lubriplate on this sliding stepper thing here, and on this ratchet thing here. And I also put a coating of it on this bottom of this idler arm here that makes contact with this stepper assembly here, so it'll ride smoothly. Now I'm ready to put it all back together. Okay, we're almost back together, and there's light at the end of the tunnel. Now there are 3 places on any phono drive that you do not want even the slightest amount of oil or grease, because it will wreak havoc. You don't want it on the motor capstan. You don't want it on the rubber driving surface of your idler wheel, and you don't want it on the inner rim of the turntable platter. So now is a good time to clean all that up with a paper towel and some alcohol. And when cleaning the motor shaft, I like to do it with it running and just lightly press the alcohol dampened paper towel against the spinning motor shaft. I am now cleaning this motor capstan, and we'll clean it all the way down. Alright, I've cleaned my motor capstan and the inner rim of the turntable platter and reinserted my two bottom washers on the idler wheel shaft and put a little grease on that shaft. Now we want to address the idler wheel. It looks in pretty good shape, but we have some fine grit sandpaper, and I need both hands to do this. Hold the sandpaper down and then roll the wheel over the sandpaper. Just drag it across there as you roll it, and that will get the old hard outer layer of rubber off, along with all the old dirt and gunk. And it'll make the wheel grip better and might save you a wheel rebuild, because these are not exactly cheap anymore. About $36 for a wheel rebuild these days. And you see all the black gunk that came off of it. And now we're going to take just a clean paper towel and just wipe it off, get any of the little rubber dust that might be on there off, so it won't build up on the inner rim of the turntable or the motor capstan. Okay, wheels back on, and you want to be careful with that little tiny E-clip, and a little magnetized screwdriver can sometimes help you out there. Alright, let's look at our position and make sure we're at the right spot level on the capstan. 16, 33, 45, 78, and neutral. So we're ready to put the platter back on and give it a test run. Alright, motor's on. 78. 45, that sounds a little noisy, doesn't it? 33, 16. Good torque. So why are we noisy on 45? Have I got some junk on the 45 step on the capstan? Alright, off. Alright, let's pull this off and see what's going on. It's got to be something on the 45 portion of the capstan that's causing that. Okay, I rearranged my washers, 3 on the bottom, 1 on the top. And that seems like it's taking care of the problem.
Not to blame, that's why they called him Sophie, that was how he got his name.
Yeah, something appropriate for this type of record player. Now this one gets loud enough, but even with a 3-volt cartridge, it doesn't get as loud as the Motorola that we recently serviced. But I think the reason is that Motorola is a little bit higher end record player and uses a higher gain tube than this one. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to shunt a capacitor across the cathode resistor and see if that'll give us a little more gain. And if it does, then we'll just make that a permanent addition to this amplifier circuit. Okay, the capacitor does indeed make a difference. That's it without the capacitor. Come on, make contact.
That's why they call him Smokey, that was how he got his name.
This is so, there we go.
If you've ever seen
that's with,
when a fire is running
and that's without, so it does sound a lot better with it, so that's going to become a new addition to this amplifier circuit. Alright, here we are with our new capacitor, 22 microfarad, 50 volt, connected in parallel with the cathode resistor, negative side going to ground, and we're ready to put this thing back together. Okay, who remembers these book record sets where you read along in the book while you listened to the record? I believe I actually had this particular record whenever I was a kid, and well, I'm sure it got beat up and banged up from me abusing it, and then it got thrown out, and then years later I found one at the thrift store, and I think I bought several different ones that day, and they sold them to me for 10 cents a piece as the book rate. That's what they were getting for books, and she said 10 cents a piece, so I bought all they had. So we'll give it a go, and sure this will bring back memories for some of you.
This is your Masters of the Universe read-along book. Every time you hear this sound, it means it's time to turn the page in your storybook. Now, we are ready to begin. Open your book, and we will start the story of The Revenge of Skeletor. And remember, when you hear the sound, turn the page. Deep in the farthest reaches of space, in another dimension of time and reality, there exist two worlds which orbit the same sun. One of these planets, a place of...
It gets plenty loud on a higher modulated music record, but yeah, a lot of these little record players were designed on purpose not to get very loud, so kids listening to their childish nursery rhyme records and whatever wouldn't irritate everybody else in the house doing so. Here's a 16 RPM record.
Copyright 1896-1897 by Rudyard Kipling. Recorded in 5 records for the Library of Congress and the studios of the American Printing House of the Blind, 1964. Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the publishers, Grosset and Dunlap. Publishers. Read by William Gladden. Notice to listeners, it is important that talking book records be kept free from grit and be kept in order.
And even though we don't have the proper needle for 78, there's an old 78 from the 20s. Alright, there you go. Hope you got something out of all this, and more to come later. Okay, another thing we can do to make this thing sound a little better, I almost forgot this, is we can attach a capacitor between the plate of the output tube and the cathode of said tube, and that will cut off some of the high end. It won't sound so shrill. Oh, probably about a 0.02 microfarad ought to do. Although, you know, it's a personal preference. You know, just use something that gives the amount of treble cut that you're happy with, and that'll work. But usually, I've seen them anywhere from 0.01 up to 0.047. So we'll just go with a 0.02 and call it a day. Okay, there's our second new addition to this circuit. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't they add those parts from the get-go? They weren't that expensive. Well, no, they weren't that expensive. Probably to them a few cents, considering they'd have been buying in huge quantities. But when you take a few cents and multiply that times a few thousand record players, then that could run their bottom line up, and you know, so that's the reason they didn't incorporate these little designs into this circuit. This was just a bare bones, minimum, basic design.
As well, Coco Washington, so we here to tell, and patched up the crack in the Liberty Bell.
Okay, that sounds pretty good, and now you can also play records that are a bit scratched up and worn, and they won't be as noticeable with the high end attenuated. Oh, and another thing I did that I failed to mention is the original filter capacitor was a 50 microfarad and 30 microfarad at 150 volts. And since this uses a solid state power supply, I upgraded the capacitors to 68 microfarad and 47 microfarad to give a little bit better filtering, and I upped the working voltage to 250 volts since we have that initial turn-on surge that's up to 170 something volts. So with those new capacitors, we got plenty of headroom there to take that surge voltage. As far as the needle, this is one of those little typical kiddie record player needles. It's held in place with a small set screw. And with the current needle, just be better off staying away from 78s unless they're the newer microgroove type. Of course, you could install a 3mm needle, but then you wouldn't be able to properly play microgroove records. Or you could install a 2mm all-speed needle. Those were very popular in the 1950s, especially in cheaper record players. They were a compromise size between a 1mm mono microgroove needle and a 3mm 78 needle. At best, they did okay with mono records. They still didn't sound that great with either type of record, microgroove or 78, but they're certainly not good for stereo records. But like I said, it's not like I don't have machines with proper 78 microgroove flippable needles in them, so, it's no big deal. Of course, the only other option would be to find a new old stock universal tone arm with the flipper type cartridge and replace it with that, but I'm not going to all that effort on this.
Every time you hear this sound,
the other one I have.
Page in your storybook. Now we are ready to begin our adventure. Open your book, and we will start the story of Castle Grayskull. And remember, when you hear the sound, turn the page. Silhouetted against the dark sky, deep within...
And of course, this type of cartridge and plastic tone arm is not really suited for bass-intensive music records. They tend to skip, but these record players were never really designed to play such records. They were designed to play just what you just heard, these little kiddie records. But even still, I would think this record player is better than a modern Crosley. At least it could be repaired and has better tonal quality, and that's pretty bad when a bottom-of-the-barrel kiddie record player beats the so-called modern technologically advanced record player that's supposed to be so superior to this old technology. Okay. Now it's playing that record okay. And I just glued down this paper covering it's lifting. I'm not going to attempt to clean this. It really doesn't look that bad because it's been my experience that this little paper thin covering, you try to clean it, and sure as the world it's going to either stain it or it's going to rip it and make it look worse than it did. So the best thing to do with this kind of stuff is if it looks okay, leave it alone. Alright, I think that's about all I've got for this one, and we'll let it go from here, and we'll come up with something else later. I didn't even notice this. I don't know how I missed this stain on the side, but still in all, this thing's in a lot better shape than 95% of these that you're going to find out there. In fact, most of the ones I've found, like I've already said, have been neglected and just used to death, and they weren't taken care of because they didn't cost that much in the first place, and that's just the way it was. But this one's still, like I said, and it's very much so still presentable. Alright, that's it. More to come later.